All right. Hey, welcome everyone. It's good to be here with you today. We are talking about the life and times of Avram, better known as Avraham. And today's class was based on, at least loosely based on, partly based on Torah portion Lech Lecha, Genesis chapter 12 through the end of chapter 17. We're talking about locations. And one of the things that I want to bring up, and then I'm going to bring other people in. First of all, alert, it's noon here my time. I have to be winding down and stopping around 1 p.m. today to go to a granddaughter's birthday. So I appreciate your understanding in that. She would be very upset if I'm not there on time. Okay, so one thing I want to say, and then I'm going to bring in some of you great teachers and students of the text to help us understand and unpack. One of the things that I want to tell you is, let's say I started talking about a place called Terminus, Terminus, and I'm describing this location, and you don't know this place. And I tell you, no, you know where I'm talking about. Let me tell you where I'm talking about. And I start describing it, and you're like, well, I've never heard of this before. You're like, oh, come on, everybody knows this place. And you go, well, can you give me any clues? You say, well, later it was known as Marthasville. You go, Marthasville, I don't know. Everybody knows Terminus and Marthasville. And you say no. And I said, what about Atlanta? Have you ever heard of Atlanta, Georgia? And you go, well, of course I've heard of Atlanta, Georgia. Well, that's originally the place, the land upon which Atlanta now is situated was originally called Terminus and then Marthasville. Now, we know biblically that certain names have changed over time. You know, the classic example that throws a lot of Bible scholars and students off or ties their hands is the fact that in the book of Exodus, it talks about Ramesses and Pithom and the store cities, and people go, well, we know that these are dated to this particular century, and it shifts everything. And you're like, well, maybe that's a scribal update to a text. Maybe that was, and then people have proposed another place altogether. We won't get into that. So there's that. But then the other thing that happens quite often, is that people make what they think is a great discovery. And they propose that it sheds light on the biblical text, and that catches on, and it becomes accepted by the academic world, and then it is taught in seminaries and colleges and enters into textbooks, and so that ultimately is part of what we're dealing with today. So what I'm proposing here on, for instance, the location of Avram's birthplace is not something that I have discovered on my own. In other words, other people have said it too. People, I think, far brighter than I am, maybe. But the biblical text led me to say Ur of the Chaldees, as identified by Rollinson and Woolley, does not fit the biblical description. That made me look northeast. That brought me to this understanding. So, having said all that, welcome, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get this show going. Damon, how are you, Damon? You got to unmute. There you go.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. How are you?
Doing pretty well. And by the way, I thought that your presentation was absolutely brilliant. I had heard before that there was a dispute over the location of Ur of the Chaldees, but I'd never actually looked into it. And then I heard you present it. I'm like, wait a second, this makes complete sense. I absolutely agree. So you sold me right off the bat.
Good.
So,
well, I tell you,
you,
Damon, and I appreciate your studious approach to the text. So I would appreciate it if you follow up too, as your schedule allows, and really dig into this because I
Mhm.
found it to be quite a compelling case. So I'm interested in your take if you ever get around to that. So
It sounds like a compelling case, but yes, I will look into it. So,
what else can I help you with? What can you help me with, let's say?
I wanted to dig into the chronological difficulty you brought up with the age of Terah and Avram.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like there's definitely something going on there that the text does not explain. And as you mentioned, the Samaritan Pentateuch
Yep.
tries to fix.
Yep.
And I have a different take on that, and I wanted to run it by you.
All right.
So, one of the things that we notice just looking at the text and trying to deduce things from the text, like you said, we have in Genesis 11:26, it says that Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran
Mm-hmm.
after 70 years. So there are three people there.
Yeah.
If you go back and look in Genesis 5,
Mm-hmm.
the end of Genesis 5, Noah was 500 years old and he fathered three people there, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I don't think that either Terah or Noah fathered triplets. I think that these were individuals that were fathered at different times, but the question is when. And if Abram is the firstborn, well, then it would have been at age 70. But if Abram is not the firstborn, then that throws possibly a different light on what might be going on there. So, in order to figure out whether Abram is the firstborn or not, I want to propose something and also explain an ancient Near Eastern custom. What they would typically do is pass the responsibility for managing the household from father to firstborn son, and they would stay put. They wouldn't go somewhere else. They would stay right there because that was their land claim. And that firstborn son would continue running the family estate and pass it on to their firstborn son after that. But Abram went somewhere else. So I think what the text is implying is that he's actually not the firstborn. That Nahor was probably the firstborn because there was a city of Nahor, and that was where his family estate was. Um, so if we look at Nahor being the one that Terah fathered at age 70,
By the way,
then
what let
yes,
me I'm sorry, just one other point. We have two Nahors in the text, just to keep people clear. So
yep,
Nahor is not necessarily just the son of Terach, and therefore the name of the city was after a son of Avram. What we have Nahor is also an ancestor of Terach, and so some might argue, and I would, that the name of the city is not attributable to the son of Terach, but rather to the ancestral house. But anyway, I just wanted to bring up that there are two, right?
yes.
Okay,
And
all right.
that's perfectly valid because it looks like Haran might have been named after Haran, the son that died. So good point. But yeah, I think that it is the Nahor that's the ancestor, not the Nahor that's the son. Um, so if you take Terah's age when he died, 205, and you subtract uh, uh, Abram's age when he left Haran, which was 75, you get that he would have been about 130 at most when he fathered Abram, if Abram stayed there for a while. But I think what the text is suggesting is that Abram is not the firstborn and that he actually uh, left after his father Terah died because Terah fathered him later in life. So I just wanted to run that by you.
Okay. All right. And while all of those possibilities exist, and I think, and I can be considered very strict with the text, but I don't have enough to say that those things are. I don't have a text to support that. I can speculate and say, well, maybe he wasn't, and then therefore, but what would that gain me? So that's the question. What we have is we do have a problem that's not easily taken out unless you're a Samaritan Pentateuch scribe and you just say, I've got to fix this because the math doesn't jive. And then they just change the number. Or, of course, the other view, this is not the one I accept, but someone else might say, well, the Samaritan Pentateuch may be the correct reading all along. And the Masoretic text is reflecting a later reading. But we know that that's not to be the case because of other ancient witnesses, other textual witnesses. So, but anyway, again, there are a lot of possibilities, but what we see is that there are discrepant passages, and we're left to kind of deal with what do we know. And to be honest, and this is what we always try to do, you and I, we're dealing with texts that are presented as being extremely ancient. And so how accurately have they been transmitted? I don't know. I want to think pretty accurately, but at the same time, we only have so much with which we can form our opinions. So
Sure.
Anyway, good stuff. Good stuff. All right.
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
I might jump back later, but I just wanted to run that by you guys.
Hey, I appreciate you, Damon. Thank you, man. All right. Karen, how are you, Karen?
Good. So Abraham's one of the most fascinating characters to me in the biblical text. And I've done a little bit of study on him.
Okay.
Mostly going back to what's the political climate of the land during his time and things like that. And I always have this idea that Abraham is, he's an Akkadian. Because 300 years or so prior to his birth, the Akkadians come down from the north.
Yeah.
How far up north they live, I don't know. But they come from the north, and they're a Semitic speaking people, and they come down into Mesopotamia, which is, like Sumeria, it's not Semitic. It's not a Semitic language. It's a completely different base. And they start to take over Mesopotamia. And if you go back to Sargon of Akkad, he's an Akkadian, one of the first Akkadian emperors. He's starting to take over all the city-states of Mesopotamia and making them one kingdom, if you will, where he's taxing everyone and all that. And he's implementing Akkadian as the language. And he's placing, and when we think of, one people conquering another people, we think of, after the Exodus, when the Israelites are going in and wiping out the cities and so on. But that's not how they're doing it. They're not wiping everyone out. They're going into their religions and putting their people in as the priests, putting their people in as the government. This is the kind of thing Sargon of Akkad did.
Yeah.
And so you have Abraham showing up about 300 years later, where, and it's possible his father was, high up in the priesthood. We don't know. That's kind of like alluded to a little bit. And then you have a political change around that time, where native-born Sumerians are taking back their city-states, and they're switching back over to Sumerian. And you see some other places starting to develop. Babylon becomes Babylon and things like that.
Yeah.
So, that's about the time of Abraham where this political upheaval is happening, where Semitic-speaking peoples are being driven out of that part of Mesopotamia. So that could have been, some of the reason why Terah starts to leave. They're taking back their religious, they're putting their people back in the priesthood. The Sumerians are. and the Akkadian empire starts to fall at that time. And so, that I kind of put that, add that into the story of Abraham.
What's your what would you consider, if you think about it? You may have several, but are there any books that you found very helpful in kind of getting a better understanding of this period? And if you don't have them off the top of your head, that's fine. Maybe you can show us later or whatever. But
Not book, mostly just articles
yeah,
from academia and
gotcha.
other people. So we see that. And at that time, Armenia, it's not, I always wondered, why are they calling him a wandering Aramean? That was always like a big question to me.
Yeah,
And at that time, Armenia is not called Armenia. The people don't call themselves that anyway. They call themselves the Hay. But you do see I think the earliest that you can see Armenia being referred to is around 600 BC in Old Persian. You do see it referred to as Armena. And at that time, you're going to have Hebrew scribes in Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar drags them off, and he takes Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're scribes. They're the learned of the land. Puts them in his palace, and what are they there doing? They're recording. And Persians and Babylonians, they're notorious for recording stories. You find a library in Nineveh belonging to Ashurbanipal, and he's recording stories from everywhere.
Yeah.
And they're not just recording their own origin stories, they're recording them for a Persian audience. And so it would make sense to me that they're using the Persian word for that area, which is Armena.
Yeah. We've learned a lot. Scholarship has learned a lot based on cuneiform tablets that have been discovered and so forth. And it's really quite enlightening what we now know that we didn't know before some of these discoveries. I mean, I'm always amazed at what we have going on with, the more you find, the more you know. And like you're talking about Akkadian, I always liked this idea. My illustration in the class was in southern Louisiana where I live, or in Louisiana where I lived, right across the river. We have people, and they're also referred to as Akkadian. It's ACC here, French-speaking Cajun types, and so I think about that when I think about everything that's going on in the biblical story. But that's just weird things that hit me.
Yeah, and Akkadians are Semitic-speaking people.
Yeah,
coming from, and in the Ararat mountain range, which is which is Turkey and near Armenia, is the first evidence of domestic grain and domestic grapes that they can find.
Okay.
So it makes sense that there was, post-flood, there was an early settlement there. And I do know the Greek myth of why it's called Armenia, if you want to hear it.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's actually from the story of Jason and the Argonauts.
All right.
I think he's popular. The story's popular from like 300 BC. Apollonius, he writes the story, but he is mentioned by Homer around 850. So it's like this well-known Greek myth at the time, and Homer's kind of recording it a little bit. He doesn't do a whole epic poem on him, but he does mention him in the Odyssey.
Gotcha.
And they think that the story comes from pre-Trojan War. A group of Mycenaean heroes, if you will, they get on a boat and they do some journeys, and they actually make it home to talk about it.
Okay.
That's where they relate the origins of Jason and the Argonauts. And on this boat, there's a Greek or Mycenaean, if you want to call him, sailor named Arminos. And Arminos, after they're done with their journey, he goes back to where Armenia is today, and he becomes their, I don't know, root king or something, and he gives them their name.
Yeah.
And that would be like 13 or 1200 BC. I mean, that's just their story, but I don't know if that has anything to do with anything. However, original Armenians, they call themselves the Hay, and so they would refer to their country as Hayastan.
The
And I think
Hay.
they would, even in the Middle Ages, they would call themselves the Hayastan.
Okay.
Hayastan, the country. And that comes from their first king, whose name is like Hayk, Hayk. But because before that, they're tribes. They don't have like an organized kingdom or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I see Abraham more as the wandering Akkadian, not necessarily the wandering Armenian.
Okay. All right. Good insights as always. I know you dig deeply into these things. Was there anything in this presentation that really jumped out at you or challenged anything or made you think again? I mean, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, I haven't really looked into exactly where he was born or looked at a map and tried to figure, I haven't done that yet. A lot of it is, I'm studying other things and I run across stuff and the kind of, puzzle pieces together here and there.
Right.
But
well, good stuff.
Out and trying to figure things out.
Hey, me too. We're all doing that. Good stuff. Anything else, Karen?
Nope, I think that's it.
Well, hang around. You'll probably think of something else. Stand there with your hand ready to jump up. I wanted to say a couple other things before I get the next speaker up. We do have a couple of people who are trying to enter. If you get a note from us, like we may hold you in the waiting room and we say, who are you? Because your name might be something that we don't recognize. Don't be offended. Please just answer the question that you're getting from our two-person staff here that says, hey, who are you, before I let you in. And that's for the security, and we're just trying to do a good job on that. So again, just give us a name, and because a lot of people use names that aren't really their name or we don't recognize them. All right, enough said. Rodney Runyon asked a question in the chat, and the question had to do with Beitel. Let me tell you, let me back up to that so that I get that quite right. Do we know the location that Avram built the altar between Beitel and Ai? Is there any archaeological evidence for the location? One of the places that we go on the Tanakh tour, by the way, we've got that. It's posted. I need to tweak the itinerary to reflect a newer version or revised version of that itinerary. Basically, it's right. You'll see it's called the Ultimate Tanakh Tour. We start in Egypt. We do Egypt, then Jordan, then Israel. Karen, who just spoke, is one of the ones who's already signed up for that. Others of you might want to consider that. November of 2025, prayers that everything will work out and we'll be able to safely travel with a group then. But having said all that, we go to Beitel and we just sort of eye the area. Not intending to be a pun on AI, but we EYE the area, and we know roughly where these places are. What we don't know is with any precision, again, you're talking about something very specific, very, very ancient, and while we have found altars in some of these areas that are quite old, it's difficult to, I don't think we've found anything. We haven't found anything that said this is the place where Abraham was, and I know you know that. So now recently, kind of related to that is the Mount Ebal altar that is proposed. It's been all in the news. I've written various things, and Jonah and I have had discussions about the Mount Ebal curse amulet. Some of you might be interested in looking on my academia page and digging into that a little bit. that is proposed by some who advance that to be an altar of Joshua. You know, they'll say Joshua's altar. I think it's too much speculation, not enough evidence to say exactly that. But again, you know, and I'm not trying to be a minimalist here, but, you know, we have to be very careful before we put a name on it. But having said all of that, the area of Bethel and all of these places where the patriarchs went through are quite fascinating. There are archaeological digs in and around that area. So hopefully that's a little bit of a help. The answer is no, we don't know exactly, but we can get you on a bus and put you in the neighborhood if that makes sense. All right. Let's see who's next. Who do we have here? Todd and Angel, did I see your hand raised? If I did, I don't see it now. Who's next? Raise your hand again if I just, oh, here we go. Julia. No, Todd and Angel, there you are. I was on the wrong page. All right, I'm awake now.
You're awake now?
I'm awake. Good
Shabbat
morning.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
You got my brain going again on kind of a different tangent of what we're talking about right there. When you read Joshua 24, and you're talking about the Abraham, or not say Abraham, but about how the forefathers had worshipped other Elohim, it got me to thinking in the book of Jubilees. I don't know how familiar you are with that.
Yeah.
The little Genesis, but it goes into the story of Abraham when he was younger and his father's idols.
Uh-huh.
And how he chastised his dad for the idols. And his dad was like, well, the people expect me to make them. I mean, I can't just stop making them.
Yeah.
And he says, I can't tell them the truth because they'll kill me. He says, so keep your mouth shut so they won't kill you.
Right.
I just thought it was kind of interesting when you read that, because I was like, well, there's no evidence, I don't think, in Genesis, but there is in Jubilees. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Apocalypse of Abraham, but that kind of tells a little humorous story about the idols. But
yep.
Yeah, just
well,
for a different
let me ask
read.
you this, because I know you guys dig deeply as well. I think about stories like that, and it reminds me of George Washington and the cherry tree.
Yeah.
You know, it really does. It's like we look at our biblical heroes, and I think over time, anytime there is a gap in the historical telling, that's one that someone says, hey, I got a cool story to plug in there. And, you know, and I think that's what we see. We see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see, you know, you take a figure like Enoch, who vanishes. He was not, because God took him, and you're like, huh. You know, the inquiring mind says, well, where'd they take him? Sit down, son. Let me tell you a story. Enoch went to and then we get all the embellishments in the later storytelling, at least in my view. I think that's it's sort of an open door for very vivid imaginations. Now, do I know that? Well, I don't know. What I get from the text in Joshua 24, 2 and 3, it says that Abram and his brothers with their family were idolaters. Or let me not say idolaters. Let me say they worshiped other gods. And that's what the text tells me. Now, what happens, though, is you get a good Jewish teacher or a rabbi or somebody, and they go, not my Abraham. I like to think of my Abraham as being totally holy, and he never did anything wrong, and his daddy was an idolater, you know, because that's what that text is saying. This is just me playing it up a little bit, Todd. And then they say, so what happens is he was a bad guy. Daddy was bad. In fact, the rabbis discuss this, and they say, you know, he's so bad. Terach is so bad. And then the stories come out about, well, let me tell you, how bad was he? Well, he had this idol worship shop, and Abraham was a good boy, and he never told a lie, and he busted up all those bad idols. It just feels a little bit strange to me, you know?
Yeah, it does.
Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because we've tested Jubilees and found it to be good. As
I
far
like
as
Jubilees too, by the way.
yeah,
Just
as far as Jasher, now it's supposedly Jasher fills the void between chapters 11 and 12 in Genesis, but we've tested Jasher and it's interesting. Some of it might be okay, but it's not the Jasher supposedly that was
yeah,
originally written anyway.
right.
But yeah, so we just kind of on Jasher, but it is kind of interesting. It does kind of answer some questions on some things, get you to thinking a little bit anyway, but it doesn't mean it's real.
Yeah.
But, you know.
And I like those stories, by the way. Don't get me wrong, and I like Jubilees, and particularly because we have copies discovered among the Judean desert text. It's not like this thing is just whipped up since 1970 and put online where you can buy it in a bookstore. But I think that when we get to some of these expansions, we see it in the biblical text as well, but we certainly see it in what we call non-canonical works. It's usually because we have gaps in the story that we want to fill in.
Have you read the Apocalypse of Abraham?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay.
It doesn't ring a bell. But that doesn't mean that at some point I haven't. But I don't recall that.
Yeah, it's just kind of a funny story about the idols where. Because Abraham supposedly takes a hammer and smashes his dad's idols up, but lays the hammer and the king of the idol lays it against him. And when his dad said what happened, he goes, "Oh, he did it."
I think I remember that story, but I didn't recall the source. And where this, you called it the Apocalypse of Abraham?
I believe that's what it's called, Apocalypse of Abraham. I got it somewhere back here. I just thought it was interesting.
Cool stuff. Hey, send it to me. I'll be happy to read it. I like all of these stories, ancient stories that are based on or spin out from the biblical texts. So one side of me is looking for the original. Where did all this come from? And then the other side of me says, and how did it develop?
Yeah.
So both ends of the equation are interesting to me. Both sides.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I believe the Apocalypse of Abraham. I just thought it was an interesting read, especially the story about the idols. You can't help but laugh when you read it.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
If I could find a link or something, I'll send it to you.
Good deal. All right. That sounds good. What else
That's
you got
all I got.
first? Okay. Well, come on back anytime then. Good looking shirt, by the way. That is you make that shirt look
That's
good.
gonna be my new Zoom call shirt.
I love it. No, I love it, man. Good stuff.
I'm gonna have to get him a different one.
That's
So
all right.
They got to start carrying ball caps.
Hey, well, Seth and I are looking into that right now. I tell you, good stuff. All right, might be one of those two Guns and Moses ball caps. All right, Julia. Hey, Julia B. Shabbat Shalom. How are you?
All right. How are you?
I'm doing
Can you hear
wonderfully.
me?
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right. I'll be quick because I know you have to be off in 27 minutes. So I'm not gonna be the one to get you in trouble with your granddaughter.
I hear you.
Just thinking about what Damon said when he was trying to do the aging and saying he wouldn't be the firstborn because
Yeah.
this is what the firstborn does. I think that it would make it even more important if he was the firstborn. It does not matter. But when God says to go forth, that is what the importance is on. It did not matter what responsibility he may have had. The importance is on that he chose to be obedient to God. When God said go forth, he did.
Yeah.
And even if he was the firstborn, he did.
Yeah.
That is the point. The point is that he did. And I think it helps the point that you must walk for yourself. It does not matter whatever responsibilities you may have. If you are going to choose to be in a covenant with God and to be obedient, these may be some of the things you have to turn your back on.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of what the point is for the story of Abraham.
I get it. And in some ways, Julia, let's be honest here. In some ways, like I know that some people would say, Ross, look, here's the deal. I don't care if he was south over by Iraq or if he was north in what is now Syria. None of that matters to me. The important thing is God said go, he said when. Let's do it. So to that. Now, what to me is interesting is I always, if I can, I want to put the text in context, and I want to say, okay, where did this happen? Who, what, when, where, why? All those things. So, but I get it. I mean, the bottom line is, God said, "Go and walk for yourself," and He said, and He walked. He didn't say anything. He just walked.
Yep. He made the choice, and
Yeah.
I think it points out that you have to make the choice.
Yeah.
And that it may not be an easy choice.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And you may not know where you're going. I mean, to me, that is a big deal. I think if someone, let's say that I began to investigate biblical truth 40 years ago, in earnest, like really, and if I would have said, hey, where am I going? Where is this leading me? And somebody described a 58-year-old Ross, and what I believed, I'd have said, I don't think I'm going to get on that bus. I mean, honestly, I would think my young me, my 20, however old I was, 22, 23, I'd have said that man's going to hell. I mean, I really would have.
Yeah.
And I think I would have been scared out of my mind to consider some of the things that I now consider.
Yeah.
So thankfully I didn't. I just said, okay, I'm going to take this a step at a time and walk that walk as God leads me, I think. So
that's all I had.
Hey, good stuff, Julia. Nice to hear your voice.
You.
Have a beautiful day and week.
You do the same.
All right. James Brumgard, how are you, brother?
I'm doing well this afternoon, Ross. How are you?
I am doing well. My best to you and Sherry. How's everything going?
We're doing well. Though Sherry has her rough days. Today's one of them.
Okay.
But to get on to the class, I agree with Damon that the listing, the descendants of Terah, that Abraham is listed first, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's the oldest, because I look at some of these listings as he's the principal descendant that we're going to follow from here on. And that's why he's listed first. Because I've had this idea that Lot and Abram may have been actually very close in actual age of years. And one of the things that gives that away a little bit is in Genesis 14, I think it's verse 14. And it's just, I'll just read it here. I have the ASV up.
Yeah.
And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. So that idea that he looked on Lot as a brother, there's a closer relationship there than just uncle and nephew.
Yeah.
That's how I have looked at that for several years. And so, it's just the insight that I have. And the fact that he's very generous with Lot, pick whatever land you want and all that. I mean, Abram was confident that, he was wealthy enough and so on with his tribesmen that, he could make a go of it. And plus he trusted Yahweh to guide and bless him as well.
Right.
He's the one who had all the promises. There was another thing that came up. And you were reading towards the end of the class, and I can't find it, but I thought it was from Joshua, but I'm not finding it in Joshua 24. At least it didn't jump out to me in my rereading of it while I was waiting to be picked here. But it talked about, I'll read it or recite it as I remember it being read, that our ancestor was taken down into Egypt, and he was few in number and came out. I don't think the ancestor being referred there is actually Abram, but rather Jacob, because Jacob also, went to Egypt, not just Abram.
Yeah.
And because it fits the timeline of what follows next. And then it says, how we left with a high hand and overthrew the Egyptians and so on, with the chariots being drowned in the sea and so forth.
Yep. And
so
to your point, a lot of people do interpret that as in that sense. And I think a lot of that is because you can't have, not in your case, because you have good evidence there. That's a good point. But I think a lot of people, they can't have their Abraham from the same area, So the father can't be Abraham because Abraham, according to Woolley, is from Iraq. And I think there's some of that. You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does.
But to your point, it could very well be referring. I love that passage. It feels like it's got this ring of authenticity. Now, I know some people might say, well, all of it has that to me, but I don't, But good ideas, though. Good ideas. Yeah, Deuteronomy, I think the text you're referring to, it's in Deuteronomy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
26, I think it is. 26,
All right, yes,
4,
there you go. That's where I was reading that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good deal. All right,
All right, that's
anything
it.
else?
Nope.
All right, James, always good to hear from you. Thanks for calling in there, brother. Damon,
Yeah.
come on back at us.
Yes. So someone had mentioned about where Abram was between Bethel and Ai. There is a YouTube video I actually watched on that just recently. I think it's Bible Expeditions.
Oh,
is the YouTube channel.
He's got some good ones. Yeah, I've seen various proposals as to where it is, but go ahead. Yeah, he's got some really good videos.
I just wanted to recommend that people watch that one on his proposal for where Abram was between Bethel and Ai.
Yeah,
because I think it's just very, very well presented anyway. Whether you agree or disagree with it, he's got really, really good archaeological evidence there.
Yeah, and that is, by the way, where we go with the Tanakh tour, to that place that he's doing that video on. So, it's one thing to say this is generally where it happens, and here is some archaeological evidence, but yeah, we'll definitely post that. By the way, Damon, you usually do a good job of that. Post that maybe in the dialogue, if you think about it, and that way people can find it, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, Bible Expedition. I forget his name, but he does put out. He's very religious guy, but he puts out some really good videos, and they're usually pretty short, aren't they? Like 15, 20 minutes at the most. So.
Yeah, I think so. I think this one was like 20 minutes. So.
Yeah.
And one other thing that I wanted to just bounce off of people that we can kind of infer from the text. It's not direct, but I think it's really interesting. Generally in the ancient Near East, if you are going to found a new household, you want your wife to be able to bear children, but Sarai obviously was barren. So I think one of the things we can pick up from that, the fact that Abram continued to keep Sarai as his principal wife, is that there was a deep love between the two of them. In other words, they were not just there for convenience to found a household. I think there's a lot deeper relationship than just that. And for a second, I want to go back to a proposal I had made before in regarding Adam and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that being basically they were innocent and then they became not as innocent when they couldn't quite handle it yet. The relationship with Abram seems to be a big contrast to that, where he is basically mature from the get-go that we see described in this story, rather than Adam blaming his wife Eve and Eve blaming the serpent. We've got a little bit of deceit going on there, especially with the Pharaoh of Egypt. But it seems like that there's really good seed to grow a lineage from. So I just wanted to pop that out for people to consider.
All right. Good stuff. All right. Anything else, Damon?
That's all that comes to mind. I did post something on the Discord about Genesis 14
Okay.
and why that might be in the text. I don't want to get into it here because it's complicated, but if people want to go look at that, they can.
Yeah, very good. Yep, I appreciate that, and mainly just because I have a birthday party, but otherwise, so definitely, yeah. If it's in the Discord, I encourage people to go look at it. Genesis 14 is a topic that I mean, I actually you could spend a week just going
Mhm.
through the discussions on that. I mean, everything from Melchizedek and the war and so forth. And it's a source that scholars identify as other. What is that about? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls tied in? In past classes, I've really explored that. So one of the reasons, when you have an hour, you can't get into everything. So yeah, check
Yeah.
that out on the Discord, and maybe others will chime in on that text as well. Thank you, Damon.
One last thought on Abram. He was called the beloved of God, the friend of God. So
Yeah.
I think that's because of his love for his wife. In other words, God saw that, and that's what God was responding to. So just a thought there.
All right. Okie doke. Thank you very much, James Erickson. Hey, James, how are you, brother?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, good afternoon, sir.
Good to
I
have
have
you.
well, thank you. And happy Veterans Day.
Thank you. Same to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, anyways, I have a observation and to what you read about Joshua concerning the idols that his relatives had.
Okay.
And that's in Genesis 31
Uh-huh.
and verse 19, where it says that Laban's daughter Rachel had stole her father's idols,
Yeah.
and it kind of makes a little bit of context to what Joshua had to say.
Yeah.
So I'll just wait for your reply, and thank you very much.
Hey, good stuff. No, and we're going to definitely get into that. Rachel and her teraphim and what do we know? And even when you get into the Joseph saga, you have divination going on, and there's some interesting things that we can bring in, especially as we follow this family. And one of the reasons I find it so important to establish, today was sort of the lost years of Avram because, again, everyone focuses when you talk about Avram, Abraham, you think about years, even if you don't know, you think about this, it's 75 to 175. And most people are really thinking about that one great year in the life of Abraham, his 99th to 100th year. That's really where people are focused. So I think it's important to follow this family. And if we're going to follow the family, you say, well, where are they from? And the prevailing prejudice is Iraq. And I just think we ought to get that straight and put Abram and the family and their idolatries where they belong and bring them out so that people can follow it. So good stuff. But James, I'll be getting into that more as we get into following the family. So hopefully that's fair. Joshua, come on back, Josh. How are you? Whoop.
Hmm.
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great.
So my interest has really been drawn to the part of the presentation in the class today where you bring up this possible disparity in the chronology of Abraham's dead. I've read right over that, and I've never caught that before. So I know that's probably a large discussion, but it's something that piques my interest, and I'd like to talk about it on Discord for those of y'all who know more about it than I do. I've never even thought about the question. How old was Abraham's dad when he passed away? And I guess my interest kind of goes to at what point did Abraham depart his
Yeah.
dad's household? Like, how old was his dad when he left? We know that Abraham left when he was 75. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how old was his dad? And those are some interesting, questions in the text, because I think that for me, those clues and then those specifics in our biblical text, it gives a lot of meaning to me.
Well, and I agree. And so what Damon and others have brought up is a challenge to the idea that following in other words, the way I presented it is exactly the way I understood it in the biblical text. At 70 years old, Terach has Avram, Nahor, and you go through, and then Avram leaves when he's 75. We get that in Genesis 12. Well, the math says, well, the father is not dead because Terach doesn't die until he's 205 years old. And so the challenge to that is, well, hang on, Ross, you don't know that when it says he had these 3 boys at 70, like they're triplets. What do you think? They're triplets? And so then the counter to that would be, well, how old do you think? Do you think that Terah fathered Abram when he was 205? Because the order of the text is, the end of chapter 11 says Terah died. Well, we know he died at 205. So is that 205? And if so, how old? It's at least 75, because it's 75 years from his birth when he leaves. Anyway, the math doesn't add up. And the other reason that we know it doesn't.
I'm already getting confused.
Yeah, I know. I mean, but you get out a pencil and you do the math. So the other thing that happens, and this is what's so interesting, is the Samaritan Pentateuch says, I can fix this. They lick the lead and simply change the age of Terach.
Abraham's dead.
Well, yeah, instead of living to be 205, they say, no, it's 145. Well, then the math problem is solved. Anyway, it is interesting to begin to map these out, but I think one of the important things to do is to recognize that we have clearly different sources that are telling these stories. But all sources, here's what's important, I think, for people to get. All sources introduce, J and P, introduce us to Avram. We both get that. And J tells us in 17:5 that Avram, his name is changed by God from Avram to Avraham. And guess what? P follows suit. So all the sources have an Avram whose name is changed to Avraham. That seems to be the story. Now, the question becomes, and you brought this up when you started, it's Joshua 24, 2 and 3 tells us that family, the family of Abraham, they were worshiping other gods. They were worshiping other gods. Now, we like to think of our Abraham as, the good little boy who broke the idols in Daddy's shop. And as Todd brought up, there are accounts which tell us that story. But they don't get the story. It's coming off of. It's a spinoff. It's it comes in later. It's not in the biblical text. So,
sure. I think it would be an interesting study to look at how the ancient peoples worshipped other gods. We know a lot about animal sacrifices. We have stories about human sacrifices. What are the attributes of these forces that ancient people worshipped? And of course, my mind goes to, how is that different from people worshiping things today? Like politics, for example. People will place more emphasis in their personal lives on sacrificing their time and their wealth and everything else towards pursuing a political goal. And that becomes more important than a spiritual practice of worshiping an invisible, all-powerful God. I don't think that it was that much different back then. But this whole Abrahamic idea of realizing that there is something so much more important than just what we have down here on this planet.
Yeah.
That's we talk about the beginnings of the Genesis. That's the birth of something really cool.
Yeah, I think it's why I spend most of my time in these stories, because to me, in some ways, it is an escape from everything that's going on around me. And,
Sure.
people are really, really, things are divisive. Our world around us is divisive. So the good thing about this group is that we can stay focused, and that's what's so difficult. And a lot of people challenge me on that. Why don't you weigh in this or that? I said, look, I make enough enemies just from my biblical views. The last thing I need to do is introduce another divisive topic into their world. So, but no, I get it. And I love these stories, and I think that our interactions where we cause one another to think deeply about these texts without demanding that someone align 100% with our views. Whenever Todd brings up these stories or you bring up different views, that's what makes this work. It's because, oh, did you know there is a story that says this? That's what really makes this, I think, an engaging, lively group.
I agree.
Good stuff.
Especially for people who thrive on context like myself, bouncing ideas off of each other and discovering these new contexts and opens up a whole new world of ideas. I love that. So
I
thank
do
you so
too.
much, Ross.
Hey, man, thank you. You got to come see us pretty soon. Next time you swing through, stop in.
Yes, sir.
All right, brother. And Carolyn, let's get the views all the way from France. How about that?
Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. How are you, my sister?
Pretty good. I would like to, I don't know whether I've heard you say, but when Abram and Sarai, when God changes their name, he actually adds an AH to both of their names. In Abram's name, he puts it in the middle. In Sarah's name, he puts AH at the end. And it's almost as if at that point, their names have been changed to Theophoric names. And the AH symbolizes, in my mind, that he gave them his Holy Spirit, that because they were willing to step out and do what he said and obeyed him, he gave them his Spirit, put a mark on them, however you want to look at it. They were marked with his part of him in their name from that point on.
I do follow what you're saying, and we're friends, and we're here to discuss things. I do think that it is debatable what the differences are. The names are both very similar, so I can understand if the change to the name involves I to Ah, that you might look at that and go, that must be related to the syllable theophorically, like we see in Yah or Yehovah or whatever. So I get that. I follow you. What I find a little bit more puzzling, and I'm still working on this, is, and I read the note from the New Oxford Annotated Bible today. I remember it's on page 34, by the way. I'll always remember that. It's talking about that very thing. What does Avram mean? And I covered this in the class. So if Avram, for instance, we'll do him. If Avram means Av is father, Ram is exalted, you're saying his name means something like the exalted father. If you say Avraham, what most scholars do with that is they say that the Ha is tied to Hamon, which means multitude. Now, just from my experience and my studies, I don't know that we can absolutely say that etymologically that is what that means, leaving open other alternatives because, I don't see Hamon in Avraham. You see, you follow my point? But
Correct.
But the text in for instance, Genesis 17:5, he says and sort of defines the name for the reader. He says, and I'll give you another example in a minute. He says, your name is Avram, but you're going to be called Avraham because you're going to be a father of a multitude of nations. Well, that the writer, the scribe, wants us to associate the name Avraham with that definition. But in the Bible, sometimes we have what I would call folk, F-O-L-K, folk etymology, which is, let's say the writer at the time they're conveying the new name, they may not know the original name and what it really meant. They just say, that is to say, whatever. Example, Moses. The story is that Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the water and she draws him out of the water, and she calls him Moshe, for she's drawn him out of the water. And scholars today now know, because there is a Hebrew word that's similar, I remember Richard Elliott Friedman jokes with his students, and he says, the name in English should never have been Moses, it should have been Drew. Because the writer wants us to say, I drew you from the water, therefore I call you Drew. You see that? That makes sense. But really, we now know that in Egyptian, the name Moses in Egyptian means son of. And we know this because we have like Tutmosis and Akhmose and all of these Egyptian names, and it means like Tutmosis means the son of Tut or born of Tut. Ramesses means one who is born of Ra. But again, sometimes these writers, I think, have lost the actual origin of how we came to call so-and-so such and such. In your example, and I'm not shooting it down, I'm just saying the answer can sometimes be we don't really know. So I would encourage you, I know you study deeply, to continue to look at, can we validate that maybe Sarah is somehow formed with some theophoric ending? It'd be worth looking into, if that's my point.
Well, thank you, Ross.
Well,
and you're going to be late if you don't go right now.
I see. It's 1:01. That's right. I'm going to have to leave. Look, it is a beautiful day here. I hope it's nice where you are. I do have a granddaughter's birthday party. I want to say, especially to this group who's with us today, thank you for your interest in, and for those who are able and do support us financially. You mean the world to us. It's people like you that help us to be able to provide this to everyone. So thank you from our two-man team here in Louisiana. We do feel the love from all of you. Thanks for joining us. Don't miss next Thursday. Look, if you're behind on some of these Torah Pearls sessions, get caught up. I mean, what else you got to do this weekend? So get caught up. Those are fun, and it's going to be. You got time. You're only down 3 or 4 episodes. You can get caught up. Have a beautiful day. Shabbat shalom. Shavua tov. Thanks so much for being with us.